Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to this webinar from the LEDS GP Finance Working Group. Today's topic is National Monitoring Approaches for Climate Change Public Finance. My name is James Rawlins. I'm the co-chair of the Finance Working Group here at the LEDS GP. The main speaker today is going to be Neil Bird. Neil is a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, who focuses his work on currently on the monitoring of climate change public finance. And I'll hand over to him very shortly. First, just to take you through a little housekeeping, please do keep yourself muted during the webinar today. You have a couple of listening options, so you can either listen through your computer as per the instructions up here, or you can dial in by telephone. We'll have a questions session after Neil's presentation. Please use the questions bar on the toolbar that hopefully you can see to type in your questions, and we'll go through those towards the at the end. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the slides and the recording will be available on the LEDS GP website tomorrow, so look out for that. If you have any difficulties, you can always get in touch with the webinar's help desk, and that number is there for you, 888-259-3826. So just a quick overview of the LEDS GP itself. The LEDS GP is a global network of low-emission development practitioners with members from most countries and several hundred organizations and institutions around the world. We offer a range of services to members, including knowledge exchange, networking, and a range of first mover projects to help support LEDS development in countries. The Finance Working Group has currently about 600 or 700 members, and we focus on topics of course, finance and finance of NDCs. So we are very pleased to kick off our webinar program for this year with this webinar on monitoring of national climate change public finance as an important topic. Neil will explain more about why this is so important and some of the different approaches that can be used during the webinar. So after Neil's spoken, we'll go through the questions, and then after a few closing remarks from myself, a couple of survey polls will appear on your screen. Please do complete these. Feedback's very important to the LEDS GP, helps us monitor and evaluate how we're doing and make sure we provide good content for you in the future. So I'm now going to hand over to Neil, and I hope you all enjoy today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, and hello everyone. My name is Neil Bird. I am a Senior Research Fellow at ODI, and I intend to speak for about 30 minutes on the subject of national monitoring approaches for climate change public finance. And this presentation is based on a paper of the same title that I co-wrote last year, which is available online. By way of an introduction, I would like to structure this presentation taking the perspective of a national planner in a climate change vulnerable country who has been asked to review the case for monitoring climate change public finance. To do that, 4 questions need to be answered. The first is, why should the government monitor public climate change finance? What are the benefits? What are the costs? Second, what lesson learning is available to assist such efforts? And related to that, what tools exist that could support such monitoring? The fourth question and final question is what influences the overall effectiveness of such monitoring? So these four questions will form the structure of the webinar presentation. So to begin with the first question, why monitor public climate change finance? And I think it's important to recognize two very different objectives lie behind an interest to monitor public finance spending on climate change related actions. At the national level, monitoring efforts of public spending often aim to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of such spending, and in this particular case on climate change actions. But similar efforts are made to look at other policy themes, be it spending on health or spending on education. Complementing that national interest, at the international level, there is international reporting to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which aims to demonstrate compliance with the international climate change regime. And I would emphasize these are two very different starting points behind the rationale for monitoring of public climate change finance. This next slide lists 5 broad benefits that can be gained from the monitoring of such finance. Firstly, and importantly, national climate change policy formulation can be supported to understand the resource requirements for implementing the policy. Secondly, awareness of climate change among sector planners and budget officers can be raised. And this is particularly important with climate change being a relatively new policy concern, and one which, if there is to be an effective national response, there needs to be mainstreaming activities across the whole of government and the national economy. Third, as the previous slide suggested, international obligations can be met. And more broadly, accountability of public spending can be strengthened. And the final point, the final benefit to be gained from the monitoring of public climate change finance is that administrative efficiencies can be secured. Reporting systems can be made more rigorous, leading to greater efficiency. So what are the type of policy-related questions then that can be answered? And I've highlighted 2 from our work in this area over the past few years. Firstly, a percentage of government spending or gross domestic product allocated to climate change can be estimated. Such spending goals are already in widespread use in other parts of national policy making. So it's not something particular to climate change. So for example, many people will be well aware of the 0.7% GNI, gross national income target for aid disbursements by aid-giving countries, or amongst NATO countries, the 2% of GDP target spending on defence. So such spending targets are commonplace in public policy. But secondly, and perhaps importantly for climate change action at the present time, is the monitoring of finance allows again, an estimate to be made of where climate change spending is taking place across the government administration. And that can help to highlight which are the early leaders in the across government, across different ministries, who are already making investments that can be seen to be related to climate change, which can help to strengthen the coherence between policy and public spending. With those benefits, with those type of policy questions being derived from the monitoring of climate finance, there are a number of practical challenges that need to be faced in such monitoring efforts that are already starting to challenge such work. The first is the continuing definitional ambiguity of climate change actions and hence financing. And this applies particularly for adaptation finance. And this is something I will come back later to in this presentation. Secondly, in many national budget classification, a distinction is made between recurrent spending and public investments being made in discrete projects or programs. And on the recurrent side of the national budget, present-day classifications do not allow for climate change relevant spending to be readily identified. The third challenge that is particularly acute in aid-receiving countries is that in many countries, public funds, not all public funds are reported in the national budget. There are off-budget funding channels, many of which are used to support climate change actions. And then the final challenge to emphasize at this stage is that in many cases, determining the actual expenditures, the end-of-year outturns, are not readily available. Budget estimates are often published at the start of the year, indicating the intent to spend. Similarly disaggregated records of actual expenditures are less common. And this constraint at the national level also applies with regards disbursements from international sources, where many international sources will publish and make available their commitment to spend rather than actual disbursements and the release of finance to recipients. So having reviewed the reasons for investing in the monitoring of climate change public finance in the preceding slides, I'd now like to turn attention to describing some of the relevant lesson learning that is available and can help guide national monitoring efforts. So it's important to recognize that there are a set of broader experiences of using national budget tracking as a tool to better understand policy outcomes. In our paper, which I referred to earlier, we describe experience gained from gender budgeting initiatives, but here I'm going to focus in particular on pro-poor budgeting. A number of countries have made efforts to monitor public funds that are directed at activities that support poverty reduction, and virtual poverty funds that track poverty reducing public spending through the tagging of specific expenditures within the national budget, have some sets of relevant experiences that are worthwhile to consider in terms of developing similar funds for climate change. And I'd like to cite the specific example of Uganda's Poverty Action Fund, which is an early example of this, as this was introduced in 1998 and therefore very soon will have 20 years of implementation experience to reflect upon. And out of that breadth of experience, I'd like to highlight 4 relevant lessons that are of worth noting as people design climate change finance monitoring. Firstly, there is the question on the overall effectiveness of public programs. Because as with the current interest in climate change and climate finance budgets, pro-poor budgeting focuses on budgetary allocations and expenditures, not on the policy goal impacts. And one strong lesson that comes out of the implementation of Uganda's PAF is that budget tracking needs to be viewed as an integral part of a larger performance management system, the ultimate effectiveness of which is to look at the outcome and impacts of relevant programs. A second lesson learned from Uganda's PAF is the need for clarity and consensus, and particularly the latter point, over the definition of relevant expenditures. Over the first 4-year period of the Ugandan PAF, the list of eligible programs saw considerable change, with the addition of programs considered to fit the selection criteria changing. And this is or it will be as relevant for climate change actions where the boundaries of such spending are diffuse. A third interesting lesson to come out of Uganda's experience with its PAF is the need to identify what drives institutional interest within government to secure the recognition of relevant expenditures. So, for example, in Uganda, such expenditures were and continue to be ring-fenced by government and therefore protected from budget cuts during the financial year, which clearly acts as a strong incentive for sector ministries to demonstrate that such expenditure is pro-poor, which puts a high need for some centralized secretariat to validate, to verify the relevance ratings of individual programs, individual expenditures. And the final lesson that has come through from the Poverty Action Fund in Uganda, which is worth considering at this point with climate change finance monitoring being at a much earlier stage, is the danger of parallel reporting and ensuring that any reporting, monitoring and reporting system fits into rather than duplicates existing processes within the government administration. So, taking account of the many lessons from pro-poor budgeting and also gender budgeting, as well as the very early work on climate change finance monitoring, the experience to date suggests that prior to establishing any monitoring system for climate change finance, at least the following 7 issues should be considered. First is that critical issue mentioned right at the beginning: why monitor? So the importance of making explicit from the outset the objectives of the proposed system. What is it trying to achieve? And with that, the opportunity to look not only at monitoring of inputs, but also to monitor the outcomes of such spending, to focus on the results, is as important a consideration right at the start as the monitoring of financial inputs. For climate change actions, and particularly with the international climate change regime acknowledging the need for international support, the importance of distinguishing between the different sources of funding in national monitoring systems, to distinguish between domestically raised revenue and revenue that comes from international sources. And fourthly, the importance of defining what constitutes a relevant expenditure. What is climate change related spending? Recognizing that at the beginning of a monitoring system, such expenditures might be expected to change year on year until confidence and credibility is established over the set of actions that can be considered as climate change related. Another point, particularly important as is recognized in many national climate change strategies, is the value of distinguishing between spending that is directed at mitigation outcomes against spending that is directed towards adapting to a changing climate. And this has been clearly the subject of a lot of attention, particularly at the international level, with calls for balanced spending between these two different strategies. And another issue that is at least worth considering at this time of monitoring spending is whether such monitoring should be limited to monitoring what I call positive spending, spending that is supportive of the national climate change policy, or whether there is value in addition, monitoring spending, public spending, that may run contrary to climate change policies. And this is clearly coming to the fore with the increased attention on fossil fuel spending and the increased carbon emissions that arises from dependency on such energy production. And the final general point to consider that is a lesson learned from this experience to date is to explore how such monitoring can be integrated into existing budgetary systems. So how can it feed into the often very considerable national budget reform processes that are already underway, recognizing the dangers associated with parallel systems and the duplication of effort. My last slide on lesson learning begins with perhaps what is a truism, but is worth re-emphasizing. The monitoring of finance is insufficient to secure policy goals. The objective of managing public resources is ultimately one of maximizing public welfare, whilst minimizing public expenditure needed for that aim. So it is not a focus on looking to see forever increasing amounts of public spending made on a particular theme of public policy. So there is a need to consider financial monitoring and outcome monitoring at the same time, and not to view these exercises as being non-related. And I suppose my plea as an external analyst is that often it seems to me that there is quite a wide separation in the interest and discussion around the monitoring of finance or of spending and the monitoring of outcomes and impact. And we're at a stage with regards climate change of making sure that the gap between those two areas of monitoring of public effort should be minimized rather than allowed to continue separately. So building on these lesson learning experiences, what tools exist that could support such monitoring? The first important point to emphasize, unfortunately, is presently there is no one tool currently available to monitor climate change public finance. However, there are a number of tools existing that can help estimate the amount of public finance spent on climate change actions. However, these vary in their scope, in their analytical approach, and in fact the purpose for which they were developed, so that these differences need to be recognized and accommodations made. And what I'd like to do in the next few slides is to highlight 5 tools that cover the breadth of applications and focus on different sources of funding. So, the first tool is what I call climate aid reporting, and it focuses on international sourced sources of funding and applies solely to countries in receipt of official development assistance or aid. And here the OECD Development Assistance Committee maintains an online database of donor reporting on official development assistance flows at the activity level. And this database is searchable and summarizes all funding, all ODA funding tagged as climate change related by country. So therefore, country administrators, sector planners, budget officers can access this database directly to identify, to measure and verify international public climate change finance that passes through ODA channels. So for aid receiving countries, this may represent a significant proportion of the available funding. The drawbacks of this tool is that first, it is limited to international funds classified as ODA. There is a time delay between the money being committed and it appearing within the database of at least 1 year. And the data is more complete for committed funds rather than dispersed funds, recognizing that there is often quite a significant difference between the two. And it also depends upon donor self-reporting, which is recognized to be of variable quality. Nevertheless, this online database is a significant tool that national planners looking at public spending flows on climate change can access as of today. The second tool is multilateral development bank reporting, again for international sources. Since 2011, so therefore over the last 5-6 years, a group of multilateral development banks have tracked and reported on their financial commitments, not disbursements, commitments to climate change actions in developing countries. These annual reports are also available online and provide an overview of the international climate finance that is channeled through these MDBs. Importantly, this group has worked on developing a set of common principles for climate finance tracking for both mitigation and adaptation, identifying eligible activities for the former category of climate change finance mitigation. And a lot of technical analytical work has gone into this, and these principles provide an incredibly powerful and useful tool for national planners. The drawback at present, at least with the online reporting, is that public reporting is at the regional level. So nationally disaggregated data would depend upon each national government seeking that information from individual MDBs. The information clearly exists because that is the way they have built up that information database. It is just not publicly available. The third tool is more of a nascent tool. It is something which perhaps represents an opportunity for country to influence and therefore help mold the reporting framework to their benefit for national reporting. Under the UNFCCC, parties have reporting obligations and therefore may use these to support their domestic monitoring goals. Concerning financing, however, the UNFCCC guidelines for national reporting is limited, and at presently it focuses on Annex 1 parties' reports. But it is clear that guidance will develop and support will be provided to non-Annex 1 countries to support their reporting requirements in the future. So this is a tool, a space of development that national planners it is worth them following. The fourth tool, National Climate Finance Studies, is a newly emerging area of analytical work, with the first study being completed in Nepal in 2011, so only 5 years ago, and with its methodology having been extended to other countries since that time. In fact, UNDP have developed a global support program named Climate Public Expenditure and Institutional Reviews, CPEIRs, and we at ODI have also completed similar studies working with a range of national research partners in several African countries. So a common methodology is just emerging with regards to the use of this tool, recognizing that there are some methodological differences between different country studies. In addition, this tool provides a snapshot of relevant spending rather than a monitoring tool as such. So the final tool is effectively a logical extension of the climate finance studies, and that is to institutionalize the tagging of relevant expenditures in the national budget system through national budget tracking, as is the case with the pro-poor expenditure tracking within the Ugandan national budget system. So rather than the completion of a one-off study carried out by research groups, national budget tracking implies the uptake of by the government administration of climate change tracking as part of the regular budget monitoring system. With that emphasis that it such tracking is dependent upon of relevant funding flows passing through the national budget system. So having given a quick initial outline of 5 potential tools that could assist the national monitoring of climate change finance, I will conclude this presentation by looking at what influences the overall effectiveness of monitoring efforts. And I would begin by emphasizing that effective climate change finance begins with an effective national climate change policy. And what we are seeing in many countries across the world is the first iterations of such policies have been put in place, and in many cases have been supported by national strategies for climate change and their associated action plans. So what financial monitoring should be designed to do is to increase an understanding of the budget's effectiveness to allocate resources for those policy goals. Recognizing that to do that, there needs to be in place feedback loops that take on board the evaluation of budget expenditures to help formulate subsequent policies, because in the absence of such feedback loops, the monitoring of climate change public finance serves little purpose. And in the paper that we prepared last year, we tried to illustrate this as a flow of 3 stages, recognizing, of course, that there are feedback loops existing within each or between each stage. So beginning with economy-wide analysis of the impacts of climate change with current and projected greenhouse gas emissions and climate vulnerabilities interpreted. And there is a whole body of analytical work at the national level in many countries that exists, be it through the national communications produced by countries or the more recent biennial update reports. And that economy-wide analysis leads to the setting of objectives for national climate change policy, with cross-sector policy objectives established according to the analysis in the previous step. And we've all seen the recent preparation of nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC as one expression of such objective setting. But perhaps as important, if not more so at the national level, national development plans and national development strategies setting objectives that include those that are climate change related. And that objective setting stage then leads on to the question of budget management tools, within which monitoring of climate change public finance rests, to identify whether the fiscal priorities reflect the needs of national policy. So to conclude, the effectiveness of national monitoring efforts on climate change finance may be optimized when financial monitoring is first focused on securing the early priority policy actions. So recognizing the need to prioritize and to sequence, and possibly to identify where carbon emissions reduction potential is highest, and equally where adaptation efforts support the greatest number of the most vulnerable. In both cases, recognizing that the amount of finance may be very large, where major public investment programs are required, be it with renewable energy investments or investments in the water and sanitation sector, or in fact, the quantum of finance might be quite small, where regulatory implementation is necessary to drive reform which may come through private sector action. So what I would finish by saying is that the quantum of finance is not everything, and it may be as important to monitor quite small funding streams where those meet strategic early policy priorities within national systems. So as I said at the beginning, this presentation is a short summary of what was written in the paper that was prepared last year, which is freely available online. Type in the title to Google and you will readily find it. And with that, very happy to respond to any questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. James Rawlins here, the moderator, back. So we have had a couple of questions, and I will start off. So I'll just read some of these out, Neil, and then perhaps you could answer them. So starting off with, can you define climate finance and some of the different types of climate finance? That's the first question.
That's a good starting question, which many people have given much thought to over the last 5 or 6 years. Firstly, I would start by saying that the Standing Committee on Finance of the UNFCCC has proposed a working definition based upon activities that underpins their biennial reports on climate finance and is available in the introduction to those reports, which provides international guidance. From much of the national studies which I have been personally involved in addition to the international discussion, there is a clear pressing need to support early national level discussions so that within each country emerges a consensus of what climate finance is that is relevant to country circumstances. It invariably builds upon a set of actions, climate change actions, which everyone is happy and confident as saying relate to climate change, are actions that respond to climate change, both in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but also adapting to climate change. And that has proved both possible and has been a valuable process to work through at the country level. As I also mentioned, with regards the tool of multilateral development bank reporting, they have also come up with a set of activities which they consider are related to climate change, and therefore spending on such activities can be described by them as climate finance. So there is international guidance on drawing up a national definition of climate finance, but I would emphasize determining that definitional within each country is important.
Great. So 2 questions now, quite similar, so I'll read them both out. Perhaps you might choose to answer them. sort of together, both on the institutional side. So the first is, from your experience, which institution inside countries is responsible or should be responsible for climate change public finance monitoring? And what type of relationship does that institution need to have with other administrations, and what type of human resources are needed in that institution? So that's the first question. And the second is there any institutional arrangement that you suggest to align climate change policy with national priorities and therefore to allocate climate change budget properly?
Again, thank you for raising a very important question. The institutional responsibilities are often shared within the government administration in many countries, but I would highlight three locus points within the government administration which are clearly critical to the effective monitoring of climate change finance. At one level, climate change finance is just another characterization of public finance, and the institution responsible for the oversight of public finance in most countries is the Ministry of Finance, and therefore the Ministry of Finance needs to be playing a central position in developing monitoring systems that relate to public finance. So that would be the first part of the government administration which is clearly necessary. In addition, in order to make the link between spending and policy, there is most often a separate ministry charged with the responsibility of national planning. And in some cases, its institutional characterization is a National Planning Commission. It is often the institution that leads on national development planning. And I would say that equally, the involvement of that part of the government administration is critical for what I've emphasized during the webinar, the close linkages between the measurement of financial inputs to public supported programs of work and the measurements of outcomes, and ultimately impact of such programs. So that would be a second key institutional player in the development of national monitoring systems for climate change public finance. And the third, and perhaps there is an implicit prioritization in the way I've described the different parts of the government administration, but the third institutional locus for monitoring of climate change public finance is that ministry which holds the remit for climate change in the country concerned. And in many countries, it is housed in the Ministry of Environment, where the UNFCCC focal point person sits, and they often have key networks into the international system through invitations to attend the UNFCCC and its associated processes. Such people have unparalleled expertise and experience on the issues of climate change. They are the technical lead with regards to climate change, and with climate finance being defined through its activities, the Ministry of Finance needs the support of not only the Ministry of National Planning, but also the Ministry of Environment, or whoever acts as the lead with regards to climate change. So in terms of the institutional makeup, I would say those are the three core elements of the government administration. To make the monitoring of public climate change finance work, however, also involves the line ministries, those ministries that are implementing public programs relevant to climate change, be it the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Energy or the Ministry of Water, Ministry of Infrastructure. And I suppose that is what makes the challenge particularly acute for climate change, is how to secure core leadership, perhaps within the three parts of the government administration that I mentioned, but also the active involvement and participation of all parts of government. So that's what I would say in terms of the institutional question.
Thanks, Neil. So a couple more focused on the interface between public and private sector now. So we'll start off. We've had a comment, but I think it's worth you responding about the role of public finance in mobilizing private climate finance is important to recognize and is relevant to monitor as well. So do you have any thoughts on that interface between public finance and private finance, Neil?
The first point I would make is that this starts to go outside my particular area of competence, which has focused on public finance management as it relates to climate change actions. However, having said that, there is clear recognition, both at the international level and at the national level, that private finance and action by the private sector is a critical component of the national response to climate change everywhere. Whilst it is reasonable within our unitary public finance monitoring system to monitor the support that the public sector provides the private sector in terms of initiating climate change actions. And that I see as a component of the work that's already been carried out with regards to public expenditure reviews on climate change. The monitoring of private finance, be it at the national or international level, has undoubtedly proved to be far more problematic, with much greater challenges over transparency of such flows. So I think that's all that I feel competent to comment on with regards to the interaction between public and private finance.
Thanks, Neil. So heading back to more towards your the topic of the day, public finance, we have a question. When designing monitoring systems to track climate finance, what experience is there in terms of designing the system as specific for climate change alone, or combining it or merging it with existing monitoring systems?
Again, that's a very good question. And my immediate response is the practical experience of doing this on the ground remains quite limited. In the paper which I've been referring to during this webinar, we actually cite the experience of Nepal, which perhaps has the longest implementation experience of national monitoring systems. In that case, the monitoring of climate change is part of broader monitoring of the national budget. So I don't see a separation there. And I suppose the question might be, and it comes back to the institutional question, for as long as the monitoring effort is housed where public expenditure monitoring is carried out more broadly, which is, as I say, often within the Ministry of Finance, then the separation between climate finance monitoring and the monitoring of public expenditure more broadly is minimized.
Great. Another question, and something I was minded to ask something similar myself, is has any country already put in a system in place for climate finance monitoring? And I'm sure there are varying degrees of that, so I was thinking to ask myself, could you point to any particular countries which have really progressed this furthest? And so people listening today who might wish to go and look at an existing country example that has sort of gone further than most, would you be able to point people towards specific examples?
What I would suggest is perhaps the most effective way of doing that would be to look at the UNDP CPEIR website, as monitoring systems appear to be most advanced in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And through that CPEIR website, it immediately takes you to individual country experiences, one of which I've already mentioned being Nepal. But other countries in that region are also amongst the earlier implementers of monitoring systems. Equally, if you go to the ODI website, you can have a look at 4 African countries, in Ethiopia, in Uganda, Tanzania, and Ghana, where initial monitoring efforts have begun. In Ethiopia, this is coordinated within the Climate Resilience Green Economy Facility in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Cooperation. In Ghana, it is housed within the Ministry of Finance. So there, I would cite those as a range of countries: from Ghana, the Ministry of Finance, Ethiopia, the CRG facility, which is housed in the Ministry of Finance, through to Nepal, where much of the work is housed in their National Planning Commission. But there are other country examples that can be accessed through the UNDP CPEIR website.
Great, thank you, Neil, for those. I think we have gone through most of the questions now, so I'm going to just say thank you very much to you, Neil, for the excellent webinar today. Thank you for all the people who joined us today. I hope you found that as useful as I did and as interesting as I did. As I mentioned at the beginning, surveys are important to us, so we would like to just ask you for some feedback on how we all did today. So in a moment, a poll should appear on your screen, so I'm just going to launch that now. And hopefully you will see that appearing. So please do give us your feedback on the first one, and then in a moment I will launch the next one. And here's the second one. Thank you everyone for your votes, much appreciated. If you are not already members of the LEDS GP, then I encourage you to join up. So you can go to the LEDS GP website and find lots more details about the LEDS GP, about the different working groups, including our own working group here in the finance working group, and instructions on how to sign up. And do keep coming back to the website, whether you're a member or not, to look at the program of events and activities. There are both regional events around the world, as well as a program of webinars and other activities and publications and so on that come out. So please do keep coming back to the website to check up on that, sign up for newsletters from the different groups, etc. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Thank you again to Neil for the excellent presentation. Thanks to everyone for asking questions, and again to Neil for answering them. And I wish you all a good rest of the week and good luck in your work, and especially those of you who are going to embark on the monitoring of public finance. So thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.